We are now streaming on YouTube. Good evening. My name is Ralph Berry, councillor in Bradford. Welcome to Open Labour discussion on the future of rebuilding local government after austerity. Just to remind you that we're hosting this from Bradford. We've got people from around the country, and we have with us Steve Reed, who is the Shadow Minister for Local Government. Steve can only be with us till 7:30. So what we're going to do is we're going to let Steve give us some of the big picture stuff, and then have some time for question and answer. And then my colleagues, we've got Candice Atherton, a cabinet member for adults and social care from Hounslow.
Hi.
Hi, Candice. We've got Neil Nerver, I believe you're Secretary of Labour Group in Bradford.
Treasurer.
Neil. And Alison Everson is from Aberdeenshire Council and is President of the Confederation of Scottish Local Authorities. Is that right?
A Convention of Scottish Local Authorities. It's their equivalent of Local Government Association in England. Okay, so over to Steve.
Well, thank you very much, Ralph, for the invitation to come here tonight, and thanks everyone for coming in and joining us and foregoing the alternative attractions of whatever is replacing Eurovision this year because it's been cancelled. It's great to be with you, and we're talking about rebuilding local government after austerity, but I think there's a really big issue here, not just about rebuilding local government, but rebuilding our democracy. And I think it's quite hard to speak about one without the other. So I'm gonna try and open up a discussion around both of those things at the same time and link them. Obviously, the COVID-19 crisis has brought into really sharp focus inequalities that have long been growing across our country. You see so starkly who is being the most affected by COVID-19. It's poorer communities, it's BAME communities, it's workers who are low paid, who are less able to self-isolate because they can't work at home. It's people with underlying health conditions, and many of those are linked to poverty, and it's people who are living in overcrowded housing who can't self-isolate. So those inequalities have been developing for a long time. We have long been concerned about them, but the sharp focus this has brought them into, when you look at the rates of infection and the rates of death, is absolutely horrifying. Now, we've got the big story here is, what do we need to do with our politics to tackle and eliminate those inequalities as we seek to build back better, so that the Britain that comes out of this crisis is fairer than the Britain that went into it. I think that's our big generational challenge, actually, for the left in politics. But to look at just one of the micro issues here, local government has really stepped up to the mark in dealing with the crisis and getting communities through it. It's not unfair to say that local government is the fourth emergency service getting communities through this, but that has come at a cost to local authorities. The government originally told them that they would fund them to do whatever it takes to get to communities through this crisis. And so local councils got out there and they've been getting food to vulnerable people who are shielding at home. They've requisitioned hotel rooms and beds to put homeless people in, and they've foregone income streams like leisure centres or parking. Yep. Nationally, this has created a £13 billion funding gap for councils. The government's given £3 billion of emergency funding, but that still leaves a £10 billion gap, and the government is refusing to confirm that they will fund that. So they're breaking the promise they originally made to councils. And because councils, unlike national government, cannot borrow or increase taxation above the very sort of the limited amount that the government prescribes for them, the only way that councils can meet their legal requirement to balance the budget is to close down services and sack frontline workers in the middle of this global health pandemic, or during the very early fragile stages of the recovery that comes after. And, you know, many of us are cheering the carers on our doorsteps on a Thursday night, and I think very few members of the public would welcome the idea that the government is going to make councils sack those very people in order to balance the budgets, because the government's not meeting their promise. So that's the scale of the problem we're facing right now, and we're working very closely, Labour in Parliament, our activists and our councillors in particular, to try and get the public to understand what the government's doing here, so that we can mobilise public opinion in favour of the government meeting the pledges that they originally made. I think that's only reasonable. But if I can I move just briefly? I mean, I'm open to questions on all or any of that, but I just wanted to touch on this bigger issue about building back better. and the problems in our democracy that have led to these forms of inequality to grow so stark in the first place. And I'm thinking as well, you know, as we look to what the world might be as we come out of COVID-19, it's worth reflecting on how we felt after the 2007 financial crash, because many of us, me included, thought that the clear failings that flagged up in the way that the capitalism operates would push populations towards perhaps a more redistributive, progressive form of politics, but the opposite happened. In fact, we saw a shift towards a populist, nationalist form of politics and the rise of the strongman model in many established democracies, not least the United States, but plenty of others as well. And you can already see from listening to what Trump and others are saying, they're pushing further in that direction. We're seeing much more talk now about forms of protectionism, xenophobia and the blaming of foreigners, the promotion of conspiracy theories about what may have laid behind the spread of this terrible infection. And I think that this is a trend that's been going on for so long. We cannot just expect people to come back behind a more progressive kind of politics. The world as it wasn't good enough. The levels of inequality were too great. There's no going back to what we had before. And if all we're offering is the status quo and the right is where a simplistic and wrong but alternative is being developed, then we will lose, just like we lost after the 2007 crisis, not just here but globally. I think it falls to us now to reinvent a deeper form of democracy that's more responsive, participative and accountable, that can help to address some of these inequalities in real terms, so that we can offer a better vision of the future than the whatever the attractions that some parts of the population might see in the nationalist populist offer that will be coming from the right. And now for me, a lot of this is about inequalities of power. I genuinely believe if people had the power to make change on their own terms, they do it. You see that time and again when communities get the chance to act on things and make things better for themselves, they will do it. But too often they're locked out of the power that allows them to make that change. So for me, I think we need to start thinking about and tackling the inequalities of power that underpin the more visible inequalities of health, wealth, education, and opportunity that we see so starkly all around us right now. And what that means, in my view, is how do we give people a real voice and the power to assert it in the communities that they live in the public services that they use, and in the workplace. So they're through that into the economy. It's about democratizing all forms of decision making that affect people and their communities, so that we can allow people to move from being considered just units of production or consumption in a voracious economy that consumes our lives and our relationships as it consumes the planet, and instead recognize the fact that we are all fully rounded human being with loves and needs and relationships and a sense of belonging that matters to all of us. And I believe we need to be thinking now about not just models of radical devolution of power away from the center, but new forms of localization and empowerment that gives people on the front line the ability to assert their own voice and combine together in people-owned and people-powered institutions that allow them to really assert that voice and make the changes they want to happen on their own terms. This kind of implies new forms of mutualism, reciprocity, more cooperative forms of politics, using co-production. There's various forms of that as the means by which we take decisions. You know, we see mutual aid groups all around the country now. They're kind of like a little starting point for some of this. And maybe it's worth just mentioning the digital revolution as well, because I think for too long we've kept trying to do analog politics in a digital world, and it doesn't work anymore. We can open up data, we can open up information, we can open up decision making, and I think we can remake democracy in a very real way around people. And right now, as we come out of the COVID crisis, I think our country, like much of the world, is at a crossroads, and it's either going to go further towards the nationalist, populist, xenophobic right, or we can build that fairer world and that we can really make out of this crisis an opportunity for the fairer world that I think desperately needs to to be on offer to people. There you go. Bit broader than maybe we were thinking, but I don't think you could talk about local government's future without talking about the future of democracy.
Thank you very much, Steve. Now, could anybody want to ask some questions to our Shadow Cabinet member here? If you could just raise your hand, then I can unmute you. I'm just getting used to all this power I've got here. So we've got Roy. Shall we start with Roy? Okay, Roy, far away.
Can do. I guess I was first with my hand up.
Okay.
Roy Boffett from Sutton Coldfield, which is a constituency in Birmingham, okay, for those of you who don't know it. Really concerned with the inequalities that exist between major capitalists, capital funding in the southeast and London, particularly in the rest of the country. And if you could bring the standards of investment up to the levels of London, I think we should all be extraordinarily prosperous. As it is, we have to suffer from underinvestment, rundown of assets, and extreme difficulty in raising the funds necessary to reinvest in the region. Given that there are 3 million people live in the West Midlands region, it really has got the capacity to make its own decisions on what needs doing and getting the funding for it, what needs paying for. I can't see why, other than that this belief of most politicians in their ability to control things from the centre, that justifies such an approach over the last 40 years. Okay. And one final thing, when I first joined the Labour Party in 1970, I was actually living in a small town in the Black Country called Wednesbury. This was an extraordinarily prosperous little town with its own steelworks, its own factories. When I finally left there, after the devastations of Thatcher, I think the biggest employer was the church, running youth opportunities programs. So,
okay, I'll let Steve come back now.
Reinvesting, really.
Okay, I'll let Steve come back now. Steve, Roy, so I'll mute you now. Okay, thanks, Steve. Over to you.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for the question, Roy. Yeah. I mean, it's true what you're saying. Absolutely agree with what you're saying. Although don't assume that all of London is prosperous, because the places that many Labour MPs represent are far from prosperous. Croydon North is one of the most impoverished communities in the country, for instance. So even being in London doesn't mean that you get a fair share of the country's wealth. But it's worth reminding ourselves this is the 5th wealthiest country on planet Earth, and yet we have extraordinary levels of poverty that just shouldn't exist if we had a better model of allowing the wealth and prosperity of our country to be shared more equitably. And certainly structural things like the need for greater levels of devolution and regions, city regions, but also communities able to take decisions for themselves as a key part of that. And I think one of the, we've got the Metro mayoral elections coming up next year. You've got Liam Byrne, who I think is a great candidate to replace the Tory incumbent, which is an outcome I hope will happen. But we need to see those models of the combined authorities as well as local authority. In my view, we need to give them their own constitutional basis to exist. Yeah. At the moment, local government and metro mayors only exist on licence from national government that can choose how much funding they have and what services they will be responsible for. And more often than not, government cuts their funding while increasing their responsibilities. And all that really gets localised is the blame for cuts that were made in number 10 Downing Street. So I think we need a new constitutional model for local government that exists in its own right, with its own sustainable funding that really allows local regions and communities and cities to take their own decisions.
Thanks, Steve. I mean, I've been on the council in Bradford for some years, and I remember when we were talking about the general power of competence. I think you were leader of Lambeth around that time when we were having those debates. And I think as we go into this coming period with very big elections next year, having risen to the level that we have as local government, it's also revealed how far we've been hollowed out. We are very fragile, very, very fragile. And I think we need to be putting back into the discussions with the party and the others about not just the outcomes, but the how we do politics. I like that you're talking about involving people in co-production, not doing things to people, and actually rooting ourselves much more in the community. I think we still have to shake a degree of centralism as a movement. There is a slight knee-jerk reflex. So I understand that, Candice, have you got a question, Candice?
Oh, I was actually just scratching my head, but I'm happy to come in. I mean, I really welcome everything that you've shared, Steve, and I really think it's really true that it's all about equality of power. I've recently become involved, being as a parent rather than as a counsellor, in a Citizens UK group, and we've been doing like rapid listening in the community, and they actually put together a manifesto that was going to go to towards the London Mayor this year, the London Mayor elections, and obviously that's all been cancelled. But the things that they were coming up with is just the things that, we sort of sitting around and try and think of all these ideas of what's important and what do people want. We have to sort of have more trust in the people, I think.
Absolutely.
Definitely recognise, we've been talking about recovery after COVID-19 at the council, and one of the things has been doing more community engagement and like a reassessment of our voluntary sector. And our voluntary sector has been doing some amazing work. I think there's been a tension right up until this point of, especially when we do our engagement, it feels like the council versus like these smaller groups, and it's almost like, oh, we know better than you do. And I think because of the issues around funding, it's like we're too afraid to take any chances of giving money, giving resources to groups and letting them run things, because we're too afraid of failure because of cost and because of pressure. Whereas I think if there was better funding, then we could be a little bit less risk averse and allow these communities to support the people that are on their doorstep. And I think you're right, age group, we're nervous about safeguarding and all these things. The person who can help my elderly neighbour best in this crisis is his direct neighbours. He might get sent a parcel that's come from central government, but it's not the right food. It's not that. Whereas people who live next door can say, well, what actually do you want to eat? We can get it on, when we go to the supermarket. So I think, we really have to look at sort of the models that have kind of organically come out of this crisis, and give a bit more trust to the people, listen to the people, give some of that power back, and be a lot more working together with them. It definitely, I'm finding it weird being part of the Citizens UK group, because there's so much kind of, they get really cross with the council and the councillors, and then I have to kind of admit, oh, I am a councillor as well as a parent. And then I find myself being really defensive when they're like, the council doesn't do this. And I'm like, they might complain about a fly tipping. And I know we've got Councillor Guy Lambert on this call. And then actually we're doing all this great stuff about fly tipping. But, if we don't communicate it clearly enough, if we don't say, well, what is it that you guys really want? Then, then they just see it as we think we know best, and we're coming along and we're not solving the issue. So I really like what you're saying about,
Okay, what I'm going to do to make the best of Steve's remaining minutes, if I could ask Alison and then Neil to ask a question, and that will help prime us for the debate after Neil's list. Hello, Alison from Scotland.
Hi, thank you. It was very interesting hearing from the perspective of England as well, and hearing what's going on in the local communities there. I think what's in common and what we've seen everywhere across the UK is communities coming together and wanting to do a lot of work for each other and to serve the people around them in this vulnerable situation. And I suppose that's something we need to build on. We need to build on that local democracy and make it work. A problem we have in Scotland, though, is that local councils, local government is very much its hands are tied in the money it has available to support local groups. And much of the money that comes to us is ring fenced, it's for particular purposes, and there's very little leeway to be able to respond to local need and support local groups in that way. How can we as Labour help move that forward? How can we address that issue of local fiscal empowerment for our councils?
Okay, and then I'll finish off with a question to Steve from Neil. I will unmute Neil.
And
Brent. Okay, I'm going to mute you now, Alison. Okay, thanks.
I'm going to be cheeky and push on two. One is about those of us of a certain age, there's a certain deja vu as we see our council budgets going.
Indeed.
The gap is ever growing between what we're spending on COVID and what we need, and you talked about that, Steve, with national figures, It's about how Labour worked with a dented shield for maybe 4 years, in which we've got increasing public resident expectations and less resources available. And secondly, how we actually take councillors on a journey to actually be local champions in the way that you described.
Yeah. Okay.
So, over to Steve. That should just about, if there's any time for any more after that, but that gives you three.
Yeah. No, I mean, thank you. Brilliant, brilliant questions. And Candice, I loved everything that you said. I think we think in very similar ways, and it's exciting to see a young councillor who's exploring these ideas and so active in the community as well. It's fantastic. And actually, you raised two really important points there, Candice. I think trust is so important, because trust in politics and politicians as well is broken, and it's not going to go back to the way it may once have been if it was ever like that. We live in a far more less deferential world than before. People are used to taking more decisions about themselves. They're not prepared to just cede power to somebody else to take all the decisions about them. They want to be involved. It's perfectly reasonable that they should be. So they're not going to trust politicians to get everything right for them. And I always think with this question, we need to turn it round the other way, because part of the problem here is that politicians don't trust people to take decisions for themselves. So very often, just as you were doing just then, if you find ways that you want to involve communities more in taking decisions, you will get people who are in the decision-making organisations. In our case, this is councils or government, that will have very good reasons why you must never let people take decisions for themselves, because they'll get it wrong. Now, if you're in a democracy, that's the polar opposite of what you ought to think about things. Of course, you need to have an eye on issues like safeguarding and preventing fraud and harm being caused to people. But then that's the case in council services as well in any way. And you can put those measures in place, but allow people to participate in decision making. There are so many models of co-production that we can look to and learn from that tend to deliver better outcomes, in my view. And the other thing you raised that I think is a really interesting linked issue is the one of risk. Because if all of our organisations are so risk averse, they never let change happen, then we don't innovate. And if you don't innovate, you don't find better ways to do things. So I think we need to be mature enough to allow risks to be taken, understanding that that means mistakes will be made. Now, if you make a mistake and learn from it, that's probably a good thing. If you make a mistake and keep repeating it, it's unacceptable. Yeah. But we all learn as individuals and organisations from the things that go wrong, as well as the things that go right. So I think we need more trust of people and a bigger space for innovation. That probably means being allowed to take more risks. I don't mean that in any foolhardy kind of way, but we do sometimes need to learn to let go rather than to try to control absolutely everything. And we've seen in this crisis, things happen in a few weeks that I've been told for decades, really, that couldn't happen. So, councils have done an amazing job. Service integration has happened at scale in just weeks. Services have been shifted online in just a matter of weeks. And services now have a community front end that didn't used to exist, mutual aid groups or similar things around communities. Now, let's hold all of that, let's keep it, and let's drive it forwards faster to make even more change. And I think that can be part of the difference Labour can offer. It's not just Labour will run your council better than the Tories, which is manifestly the truth, but also that Labour will involve you in taking decisions that affect you and your community, because we trust you, and the Tories never will. The Tories are inveterate centralisers. They've done it all the way through COVID. Look at the problems with shielding, with PPE, with contact tracing now, they're doing the same thing. All of it is an instinct to centralise, and we must resist that, because we have to be the party that trusts people, because we are for the people and of the people, and our democracy is rooted in a trust in people. Now, Alison makes the point about funding. It's absolutely right. All councils have less money to spend. Councils have suffered 70% cuts in central government funding over the last 10 years. It's absolutely devastating, that scale of cutbacks. But I think the way that you can try and involve communities more is by operating models of commissioning that are, to use some hideous jargon, they're outcomes focused. So you take your decisions based, first of all, by working with the community that's going to be affected by it to define the thing they want to achieve. And that means listening to their view of what that should be rather than just imposing our view of what they might want. So you listen to what they need. And secondly, you involve that community in taking two important decisions. One is how that objective will be met, so the kind of service or intervention they will have, and also who will provide it, because they should have a say over that as well. And if you do that, you've basically created a framework for co-production of services with communities, but that forces collaboration rather than competition to happen, because it creates space for voluntary sector organisations to also be involved in service delivery and service innovation, and this starts the money flowing back to them as well, so it makes communities stronger at the same time. The evidence I've seen is that this also delivers dramatically improved services as well, because they're more directly responsive to the people who are affected by them. So there's examples of that all over the country that you can pick up. And if we pull that together, there's a very powerful story about a different way to take decisions. And Neil's point, we talked about the £10 billion funding gap. We just got a campaign for the government not to break their promises, because it will cripple an already devastated local government sector, I believe. But one of the things councils are a bit reluctant to do is to tell their local communities just how tough the situation is the government's put them in. And the reason for this is totally understandable. Councils want to make their communities feel confident they can do the job that they're tasked with. So they don't go around and say, well, the government's just left us with a 20% gap in our funding for this year, and we don't know whether we can cope. We might go bankrupt, because that alarms local communities. Yeah. But frankly, we have to tell them what the government has done and why things are so tough and why the money isn't flowing anywhere, because these decisions are being made in number 10 and number 11 Downing Street. And that is where the blame must go, not to Labour town halls.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Steve. Well, I think we're aware of that. Certainly in West Yorkshire here, all the council leaders have made it clear that we are staring into a financial abyss. I work for a co-produced Leeds City Council commissioned service in the voluntary sector, and what you're saying about the voluntary sector and how we do politics and how we involve people is absolutely vital. Now, we're going to be launching after this a Open Labour Councillors Network. There are other networks sharing those ideas. I'm also a co-op councillor, and you'll be aware, Steve, co-op councils are trying to do some of those things. But the scale of this is we have less than half the staff we had when I first became a councillor. And the way funding is being distributed at the moment, even on the second round of the COVID money, they've moved from proxy indicators of poverty to a formula that basically benefits Surrey mysteriously and some of those shires. Now, that is beginning to translate into fear both within the workforce and those people who rely on contracts and commissions from local government. So I think we would be hoping that the front bench will be speaking loudly for that. It's good to hear that you're doing that. But also there's been some very cynical things that have been moved. The statutory instruments that have been moved on adult and child protection are some of the most shocking things I've seen in my entire life. I'm an ex-social worker, Steve. Is there anything more we can do to work to get the front bench the information and the tools to take up the battle on our behalf?
Well, we've I'm having very regular conversations with council leaders. The LGA Labour Group is very helpful for bringing council leaders together. And you may have seen last week, we had a very big hit on Thursday through a lot of the media, print media, radio, broadcast. I spent the whole day doing media, but we had council leaders doing regional stories on it as well. And it was all about the government's broken promise, the £10 billion funding gap, and the fact that if the government does not recompense councils for the cost of getting communities through this crisis, then the heroes we're all cheering on the Thursday night will be rewarded with job losses rather than what they should be being rewarded with. And I think that's the way that you can really get this across to the public, because they do not expect the people they're clapping to lose their jobs because of decisions in 11 Downing Street. So we've all worked together on that, and we'll keep working together on that. We want a real team Labour approach to this, from councils, councillors to Parliament, and you know, I'm here and I'm available. Get in touch with me, email me. If you're setting up an Open Labour Councillors Network, I would absolutely love to get the chance to spend some time with you all on that as well.
We will take that offer up, absolutely. And just before you go, Steve, I think there is the beginnings of a recognising of that from parts of government. I've noticed our directors of public health have suddenly become a lot more significant, and that's interesting. Bear in mind how much money has been taken from that. Any last questions from anybody there? I know we've got Barry there. Have you got anything you'd like to ask Barry?
Well, I think there's a lot of hopeful signs, and I know not just Steve, but the leadership is taking account of councillors as well. I do think we've got a couple of worrying things. One is finance. One is how a national care service, if the Tories bring it in, how it will be financed and where the power lay. I also worry that we've still got some way to go to get our message over, and it would be useful if, whether through Steve's team or Open Labour, there was a bit of a toolkit approach, of different ways of approaching people, citizens forums, just different examples of the good work that's going on that we can learn from. And being an opposition leader, it's useful to have things that we can put in our manifesto for 2022.
Yeah, those are great points. Thanks very much for that, that Barry. And we'll keep working together and finding, you know, we'll get learning from one part of the country and adapt it to another part of the country in terms of the most effective communications. But, you know, we started off talking about COVID-19. It's a very dark time for our country. What we're seeing out happening in communities is absolutely shocking. The rates of infection, the rates of death, and the impact on the economy. We have to find some good out of all this darkness. And I think you can use a crisis to drive change. And we need to make sure that the change that comes out of this is change for the better, and that we can use it to push harder than ever before for that vision of a fairer, more equitable world that we all joined the Labour Party to see. So meetings like this, where we're getting together and doing the thinking, will be critical in helping us to get there. But ultimately, it's up to us. You know, we can push this in a better place than the nationalist xenophobic right wants to take our world. You know, we're in an epochal fight, I think, right now, not just to save democracy, but to rebuild democracy around people and communities. And, you know, I look forward to joining that fight with you.
Thank you very much.
I'm sorry I've got to go.
No, I am enormously thankful. I don't know if you do this on Twitter, but, you know, thank you very much.
Oh, I'll do it back to you then.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Great to see you. Enjoy the rest of the day.
See you again on one of our future Open Labour Councillors Network events, which we will get onto once we've sort of launched ourselves after this, really.
Fantastic. I'd love that. Thanks again.
Okay. Cheers. Have a good evening.
And you.
Okay, so we've got a number of people here who might have some questions to ask though. How many of you are councillors? Most of you councillors? Any other councillors there? Okay, Guy, and right, okay. Can I see anybody who'd like to? Neil, would you like to just, I know there were some things, anything to take forward, get the debate running?
I think there's a debate about how, some very practical stuff, about how we can make, we're in a situation where we've got brilliant Labour councils in power nationally, yet we have got an 80-seat majority of 80-seat Tory government majority, yeah? And it's about how Labour manages in that environment. It's about how we have a Labour Party which is making best use of councillors. And I'm thinking here in terms of opposition watch. And I think COVID has been horrible, yeah? Awful. But I'm impressed by the way the front bench is starting to make use of councillors to actually get information into Parliament about the realities of what's going on. And I think there's still a lot more to be done, whether you're in power or in opposition, about ensuring that the Labour local government team is able to make, the parliamentary team is making best, it's not so much the Labour local government team, I'm talking about the parliamentary team in its widest sense, is making best use of what we are achieving, yeah? Secondly, which I noticed, I think there's a lot more to this discussion to be had, is if we went to our local Labour parties and we explained what we were doing, if we went to our local Labour groups and explained what we were doing, would everyone have agreed with what Steve said? I personally don't think they would. I really welcome what Steve did, said, but I'm not convinced there is a nationwide sign-up to co-production, for instance. I don't think there's nationwide sign-up to actually active engagement with the voluntary sector in the way that Steve was describing. So I think there's some challenges for ourselves as to what we want, like what our image of what we think councillors could and should be in future years. And I'll shut up.
Okay, well, I get that, because history of local government is many brave struggles, but we do have to learn and develop. And I think some of the structures that were set up in the 2000s do have the risk of becoming centralised, which is why I welcome what Steve's saying about co-production involving people and turning ourselves outwards. So, any other councillors there who would like to add something at this point? I know we've got, it's a very, very big election challenge we've got. I mean, Alison, for the benefit of those of us in England, I mean, the relationship between local government and the SNP, I hear little bits from my relatives in Angus, but there isn't a single Labour councillor left in Angus now. But how's that austerity situation facing in Scotland? Because we, you know, local government is traditionally, I think, rightly seen as the bridging point for building up to the next tier of elections, which is Westminster and obviously Holyrood. So what are the battles you're facing in Scotland?
Well, you said there's no Labour councillors in Angus. I actually am the only Labour councillor in Aberdeenshire. I'm on my own as the only Labour councillor there. So I very much know working on your own and having to build partnerships and alliances with others to make things work and to get that Labour vision developed. I was interested in what Neil was just saying then as well, though, about working locally and working with in Scotland with our MSPs in particular, because we as councillors in a local area, we are that grassroots, we are closest to our community, and we have that information, we know what works, we know the needs of our communities, and it's up to all of us to share that with our MSPs, in our case, MPs in England. But within that, I think we need to talk ourselves up as well. I don't think we should be talking about tiers of government. I think we should be talking about us working in spheres of government. We are a sphere of government. We are local government. And therefore, we need to work with our central governments at an equal level to get things done in our communities. We have different responsibilities, but we have the same end and the same communities we're working with. And I think we need to get that message across and work closely within our own party along those lines. And we're doing that more in Scotland at the moment. Our local government, our representative for local government in the shadow cabinet in Scotland, Sarah Boyack, is meeting with us on a regular basis.
Oh, I know, Sarah.
To share the kind of ideas and to see how we need to move forward together. But also, as local government in Scotland, we're obviously working closely with the Scottish government, because we do have the same communities to serve. We have lots of aspects of interest as well. So we need to keep that community, that discussion close with the government as well. We need to see what our sphere of responsibility is and make sure we can deliver it. To deliver it, we clearly need that financial power we've talked about, that fiscal empowerment. We need to have more power coming to us as local government to do what works locally in our communities. And we're describing that in Scotland as functional empowerment. We need to be able to work with the organisations in the third sector, with local business maybe, with SMEs, with cooperative societies, with other public sector to deliver services as they're required best in a local area. So we see ourselves as local government, but we see ourselves very much working with other people to get things done in our communities. So I think we need to become more confident about who we are. We need to be willing to talk more to our MPs, MSPs on an equal basis, because we've got the same ends, we want the same things. So let's share that and share that knowledge. And then let's work with other agencies in our local area as well to make sure that we can deliver with our communities, for our communities, and deliver the better services that they need and deserve, to be honest, in these challenging times.
That's really good to hear the perspective from Scotland, because we do need, you know, we do need to learn those experiences across the piece. Now, I know Candice has got quite a significant role in the council there in Hounslow. The challenges, some of the challenges we're facing affecting the most vulnerable, and councils have that duty to safeguard some of the most vulnerable people in our society, and that's where I think some of us are getting a lot of the pressure. How are those issues playing out in Hounslow at the moment, Candice?
Well, we've been meeting like weekly as a leadership group, and we're actually really sort of quite pleased with how well we have been able to respond. So I think we're really happy with our senior leaders, their responsiveness to the crisis, and we have really made sure that we've prioritised our very most vulnerable, and we've had a mixture of information and intelligence who they are. We also really have learned about new people, so we know now that there's like 22,000 people in Hounslow who are on this like shielded
list.
we feel like we've done okay protecting our most vulnerable in this time, as far as our looked after children, as far as our disabled community and community with learning difficulties. But we recognise that from out of this, actually, there's a sort of a wider group of people that we might not have even been tapped into that we need to support. So a big part of our recovery is really understanding how we can support these sort of potentially new people who are vulnerable. And I think prevention is going to be absolutely key. Again, we really need to be lobbying and pushing the government to make sure that they keep their, as Steve's been saying, you know, keep that promise of this massive gap that's now been created because of COVID-19, to fill in that gap so that we can then go forward and properly support our most vulnerable in our community and in Hounslow. So yeah, I think we've been really surprised that we've been okay with a bit of probably a bit of luck, but our care homes have not been as impacted as some of the other London boroughs.
Really? Ooh.
Yeah. So we're like the third lowest as far as sort of outbreaks. We've got a really kind of low outbreak rate, which is good. We think it's a mixture of you know, good providers. We've got good relationships with our providers. Our director of public health has been really good. She's been on the ground. She's been going to the care homes. But also, we pay the living wage, and I think that's another really important thing to talk about. Even there's still London Labour councils aren't doing that, and so another thing to think about going forward is if we pay our staff well, then we're probably going to get a better quality, staying with us longer, feeling valued in the jobs that they're doing. So, and I also think that it has an impact. So carers who are in companies that aren't sort of the council to deliver, there's pressure on them to also pay better, and it, you know, it does have a wider impact. So I think some of those things, as well as probably, you know, there'll be some things that we'll find out down the line that, you know, maybe some of it was a bit of luck, and everything could change. You know, we're really preparing. You know, things could change quite dramatically overnight. Okay. For example, we have a healthcare worker that dies. You know, we have to be prepared. The next day, you could lose like 30 or 40% of your care workforce in that care home. You know, people are afraid, and so yeah, I think we've responded relatively well. But we really recognise that we need to be supporting the most vulnerable, and going forward, now that we know more about these people, we can't then just leave them behind.
Okay.
There is a question on the chat that I've spotted from Nicola.
Right. Well, I've got, if we can take that one, and then I've also got a question from, I think it's Graham Barrett as well. I can't see Graham, but I'll work out how to do that in a minute. So if we take that, is it Nick? Who's it? Nikki? Can she on Nicola? Sorry. Yes. Hello, Nicola. Hiya. Fire away, Nicola.
Okay. So this is in part, I asked this question quite early on, so it's been in part answered. But my question was, most people have got no concept of how local government works. I mean, really lack of understanding, and in particular on how it's funded. So I was just wondering what the panel thinks about how we can help people understand that better, and then maybe want to be more involved.
I think that's something. Shall I start with Neil on that? You said something about that earlier, didn't you?
Yeah, I was going to say thanks. I was going to say a lot of as a councillor, I don't always understand how it's funded, yeah, because there are so many different funding streams and so on, yeah. But there's a serious point, I think, that years ago, it used to be that 80% of our budgets, typical local government budgets, came from, quote, the rates, yes, which then became for a short period of time the poll tax, and then the and now the council tax, yeah. And people used to complain about that because they said local government has no autonomy. It's all down to the amount of money which comes out from Whitehall with different allocation methods depending who's in power, and we want to have more control over what we spend. So we're now in a situation where there are some councils, district councils, which get no grant at all.
Yes.
And they're expected to raise everything from their local council tax and local business and business rates. And we won't even talk about business rates tonight, yeah? But there's now basically a situation where if local government, even in urban areas, in Met's first tier authorities, London boroughs is left, yeah, we would eventually be receiving no grant at all from central government, but we'd be told how much we could spend, yeah? So actually, I think it's going back to what Steve talked about, which is about, and others have, I think, about powers of competence, different ways of revenue collection, which we don't even think about at the moment, yeah? And a discussion about, which I hate to say this, about what minimum standards are and what choice electors should have, yeah? Because I'm always caught between a local and a national, yeah? We have a national health service, yeah? And as councillors, I don't think we'd advocate services in Newquay being absolutely different, waiting times in Newquay being different to Newcastle. So where does the local bit for local government fit? And I'm being deliberately provocative on this, because I think we still, if we want to have a new local government for a Labour government come 2024, if not earlier, we can't just repeat the discussions about money. We've got to have a different take about what people's expectations are about local government. And if that's the case, then we might better get the funding for it.
Okay. So I've got another question from Graham. Is that right, Graham?
Yeah.
Hi, Graham.
Yeah. It actually follows on from what Neil was just saying. Don't we need to really come out for the next election to say we're going to get rid of the council tax and replace
Yes.
something better? So, you know, it's a compromise that was never been good, a result of historical accidents. And really, it's perceived as unfair because it is unfair. And there are lots of anomalies in it. And some things which ought to be more highly taxed, like increasing in land value, are hardly taxed at all. And top limits. So there's so many anomalies with the council tax that we really ought to get rid of it.
Well, that's an interesting point, and it's one that keeps being raised, but we are getting perilously close to the American borough situation where if you compare Bradford to Leeds, Leeds has a very significant business rate base and is a couple of 100,000 bigger than Bradford. Bradford's different economic history, different industries, and decisions made 20, 30 years ago about rates when we had Tory councils refusing to leave rates. We moved into this new system on where you started from, and that's left us with a very challenging economic base. And if you look at the American boroughs, you end up with the greatest levels of need. They've moved away. We used to have a thing called grant-related expenditure assessment that had proxy indicators of social housing, ethnicity, and other things. And I think we need to accept there has to be some redistributive element in the local government formula, because it's simply, and that's not just a north-south thing. I mean, if Gosport's one of the most deprived areas in the country, Medway Towns has some of the areas of deprivation, Blackbird's estates on the outskirts of Oxford, or any other English town that will have that. But we are penned into a funding regime that gives us very little ability to innovate. All the talked about bonds or any other issue that's been around in the last 20, 30 years. We are local administration in most respects. We do not have the power to make our own decisions. If we were to get that power, I think we would find our public would be far more engaged and involved.
Exactly.
Alison, in Scotland, you know, you've got a different voting system. This is one of the open Labour things we keep looking at. Now, I realise that the history of Labour local government in Scotland is not completely glorious. I realise there were some problems in the past, and we moved to that change. How did you feel going through that change into a proportional system? Because we've got in England, we've got some places where there hasn't been a change in administration ever since the establishment of the authority. I won't mention a borough in South Yorkshire that led to some issues with, but it can then express itself. I think in Newham we don't have a single opposition councillor. Is that right, Neil?
Yes.
We
and
have,
in I forget what, a large number of London authorities have got Labour accounts for more than 75% of the council.
okay.
Yeah, thanks very much, Ralph. I've only became a councillor under the present system, so I can't compare it to what it used to be like. I don't know what it used to be like. The advantages of the proportional system we have in Scotland are that more people have a chance to stand and be represented for their areas. We also have a system where there's no council, I think, that is just one party run. Councillors have to work together with people from a different party, because that's how the numbers work. So it involves lots of partnership working to address the local area. We also have multi-member wards, so we have 4 councillors for one particular ward. For example, I work in an area where there's a Conservative, a Lib Dem and an SNP councillor along with me. The 4 of us are responsible for the same people in the same area, so we obviously have to work together in many ways as well, and it creates a different system. But I did want to actually answer the other part of Nicola's question, because I thought that was really key to what she was saying. Nicola's question, where she asked about how we can help people understand better and want to be more involved. And I think that's a key to a lot of the things Steve was talking about, democracy as well, and local democracy, because unless we have more people involved from more diverse backgrounds in our politics, we're not going to represent our communities in the best way, whether proportional system, a multi-member ward or otherwise. So to encourage more people to stand from more diverse backgrounds, it's really crucial that we let people understand more about what councils do. I know there's people in my ward that tell me they only know what the council does because the council's name's on their bin, and therefore the council's involved in collecting rubbish. They know little else about what council does. And yet from this discussion today, we've come across a huge range of things. Candice has been saying about her ward, for example, shows the immense wealth of work that councillors do, and the things that we get involved in. And I think the onus again is on all of us to share that. Using it, we've got a programme up here with the hashtag councils can, and another one, councils care, and we're sharing that kind of information everywhere. So a huge range of things that councils get involved in, so people know. And you might get people who have no interest in council funding, no interest in that kind of budgetary work, but they do want to look after vulnerable people in their communities. Other people have got no interest at all in road maintenance, but have a real interest in how the library works and getting involved in that kind of cultural background in their ward. We need to spread the information about all of us. It's our responsibility. It's not up to anyone else. It's up to us. It's up to us to spread the information about what councils actually do, to share the information, and in doing so, to encourage more people, more women, more people from ethnic minorities, more young people to stand and get involved in politics. Because until we do that, we can talk as much as we like about local democracy and representing people in our community, but until our councils themselves become more representative, we won't actually be achieving anything on that.
That's a really powerful. I'm glad we got this recorded. It'll be able to be watched on YouTube. But one of the things that a Open Labour Councillors Network could start looking at is how we can compile some of that information, share some best practice. And there's almost a need to refound local democracy and why the Labour Party is involved with that. We've got huge elections next year, but I find at some meetings, the actual role of the councillor sometimes, you know, it's not the top of many people's agendas. So we need to start putting that back there, because we've got some, so for example, one of the things I found at work in the middle of this COVID crisis is the impact of COVID differentially by ethnicity is something that we're all going to have to pick up as councillors. We will now be in possession of information about how that vulnerability has affected people right down to quite important detail. Connects with what you're saying about diversity, Alison, because we have information, and Steve mentioned the open data system and how we use data and information as well. Some of that is something I think we need to look at. I think it is quite shocking that we are seeing such massive differentials in the impact of COVID in the community, even within my ward by ethnicity. The challenge for us is, what are we going to do about that once this is over? How are we going to actually move forward, and right down to very small groups. The impact on the gypsy and traveller community is, at the moment, I fund, in my day job, I fund a worker who works for that group. They've gone through a cliff edge. It's absolutely, truly horrific what's happening in some of these smaller communities. And if we don't pick that information up, business as usual will creep back onto the agenda, won't it? I'm conscious that we're not far off 8 o'clock, and I think that's been a fantastic meeting so far. Have we got any final thoughts or contributions that people wish to add? I'm really pleased that we've managed to have that great commitment from Steve earlier. It's been really good.
I think what you were picking up on at the end, and I think Alison picked up, and so did Candice, about we do all sorts of things which are not talking about simply about how much you spend, yeah? About place shaping, about desperately trying to address inequality and actually challenge inequality in incredibly challenging times, yeah? All things that we desperately need some space for open labour to be providing a forum to discuss, yeah? Because these aren't the type of things you just do in a committee meeting.
No, and I think that time to think. So I've got the beginnings of an email list, admin@openlabour.org.uk. Anybody's got any interest in that, please put the word around. We obviously some GDPR issues in terms of getting to people's details, but we'll be doing some social media after this. And I think there is a need for that thinking space for what local government can do, what we have done, or how it might be better in the future, how it can be more inclusive, and how we can be part of that recovery. Because I remind, and if there's anything we can do to help people who are standing for election as well, my colleague in my ward's just been given an extended term. He'll have done a 5-year term. So, because we've got a massive electoral challenge, and it will be Keir's first national vote. The significance of it cannot be overstated. We really need to show that we're coming forward with ideas of relevance, and yes, we will still be dealing with and assessing the impact of what we're currently living through. So I think really at that point, unless there's any final things, it feels a natural point to say thank you to everybody for attending. We'll establish the network. We've also got our LGA reps. We've got yourself, Alison, in Scotland. We did want to get somebody from Wales. We will at the next event or next network that we have. And to find some way of sharing that expertise. But this has been one of the most positive debates I've been involved with for a while. I thank everybody for their attendance, and I'll just try and find if admin at Open Labour can tell me how we actually wind this through to a conclusion. So thank you very much. I think it's admin Open Labour. Are we able to work out how we
just say goodbye and then that's it?
Okay. That was Alex Sobel, in case you didn't guess. Okay, thank you very much and good night. Okay, cheers.